So we can start, sir.
Sure.
Yes.
Can I screen share?
Yes, sir. You can screen share, sir. I'll just introduce, and I think I'll introduce Wonder, sir, and then he can introduce everyone else.
Do we need introduction?
No, sir. We don't
No,
need.
sir, we don't need.
We can go ahead.
So should we start or?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Sure.
So when we talk about hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or any cardiomyopathy in general, we are basically talking about genetic disorders. And that is very important to realize that HCM is a genetic disorder inherited in an autosomal dominant pattern. I hope my audio is clear.
Yes, sir, you're clear.
Oh, fine. Thank you. So, and most of the mutations are now in sarcomeric genes. There are some mutations which occur in other genes also. And we must, another thing very important to realize is that there is no normal human genome. We are all mutants. That means each one of us is different from, each individual is different. And therefore, the significance of sequence variations in disease-causing genes needs interpretation and reinterpretation. So we must remember that something which has been called a disease-causing mutation today, after a few months or a few years, you might find that it is just an innocent finding. So this keeps changing. There are millions and millions of variation that occur between different individuals, and interpreting these variations is not very easy. So the other important thing from a genetic point of view to realize is something called a founder effect. And this is extremely important as far as cardiomyopathies are concerned. We must remember that any sequence variation, any mutation that occurs has its origin in a single individual. This may occur 1 generation back, 10 generation back, or 100 generations back. But every mutation starts in one individual. That means the parents are normal, and this individual has developed a sequence variation. And this is what is a de novo variation, the first individual who develops the mutation. The parents have a wild type phenotype, and this individual has developed the mutation. Now, this person has a 50% chance of transmitting this variation to the offspring, and who in turn transmit the same to their descendants. And the problem in all cardiomyopathies, including hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, is that there are thousands and thousands of founders. And that is why there are so many mutations that can cause hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So the founder effect is that over several generations, thousands of descendants of one individual can carry the variation. So if a variation occurred 10,000 years back, you will find large number of individuals who carry this variation, whereas a variation which occurred just 2 or 3 generations back may affect only a single family. And this single family affection is very, very common in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And the classical example is variegate porphyria. This started from just one individual who arrived in South Africa from Holland in 1688. This was just one individual. And from this one individual, thousands of South Africans today carry this disease. They are the descendants of this one single individual. So realizing the founder effect is very important in any genetic disorder. So the most common sequence variation or a mutation that you can say that causes cardiomyopathy in Indians is this deletion in an intron in myosin binding protein C. And this is a 25 base pair deletion in myosin binding protein C. This arose a very long time back, 23,000 to 33,000 years back, a very, very long time back. And over this time scale, this individual must have had millions of descendants spread over hundreds of generations. As a result of which, this sequence variation is present in around 4% of all Indians. So whether you screen the South, North, or the West, or even the East, this variation is extremely common. So 4% of Indians is a huge number of a very large population. The only population in which it is absent is in the Northeast. It is not seen in any population except the Indian population. It's seen in Pakistan, it's seen in Malaysia, but that is also in individuals in Malaysia of Indian descent. It's not seen in Europe, it's not seen in Africa. So this is the most common known genetic variation that is a risk factor for heart failure and cardiomyopathy in Indians. It is almost exclusive to persons of South Asian descent, not seen in any other ethnic group. It increases risk of heart failure by an odds ratio of 7, and it's found to be increased in both hypertrophic as well as dilated cardiomyopathy. And this may not by itself cause disease, but it can affect the severity of disease in patients who carry some other mutation that causes cardiomyopathy. So, but the situation, and as we realize, and this is just to explain that genetics is very complex, that this variation, that 25 base pair deletion in myosin binding protein C may not be alone in causing the disease. What is seen is that around 10% who carry this variation also carry another variation. And these people who carry the second variation, which is linked to this variation, have hyperdynamic left ventricular performance and cardiomyocyte hypertrophy. And this modulates the cardiomyocyte phenotype. And this probably the second variation accounts for increased risk that is attributable to myosin binding protein C deletion. So what I'm trying just to highlight the fact that any mutation or variation that has occurred generations back or tens of thousands of years back is likely to be very common in the population, and something that has occurred recently is likely to be found only in 1 or 2 families or within a small population group. It is likely that the disease modifying groups, like we have seen these 2 variations, may be different in the Indian population as compared to other populations. Since known pathogenic mutations, like if we screen HCM patients, we'll find pathogenic mutations only in around 40% or so. So since these pathogenic variations are found only in a minority, there is a possible role of these contributory variations, and they may have an increasing role in the causation of cardiomyopathies. And this we realize in the UK, what they have done is they've taken thousands and thousands of individuals. I think the number now exceeds around 40,000 normal individuals, individuals with disease like cardiomyopathies. They do the treadmill, they've done a cardiac MRI, and they've done a whole genome sequencing of these individuals. So they've done, for a very large population, they have done a very, very good cardiac phenotype based on standardized protocols of MRI, standardized protocols of exercise testing, their ECGs, the echoes, everything is recorded, and a whole genome sequence is available for a huge number of these individuals. And now what we are able to detect is modifying genes which can minorly increase your QRS by maybe only 10%. Genes that increase the left ventricular wall thickness by maybe 5% or 10%. Because these massive databases are today available, these contributory variations have now been increasingly shown to be very important in the causation of cardiomyopathies, especially in patients who have mutations that cause relatively mild disease in many individuals. So are Indians different as far as other population groups are concerned? Yes. Novel variations, that means variations which occur in our population but do not occur in other populations, have been reported in up to 50% in some studies. But if we look at the PGI database, around 1/5 of all mutations or sequence variations which are present in Indians have not been reported in any database. And this depends on the founder effect. So 1 out of 5 sequence variation that we find in Indians would not be present in any other population. The problem this creates is that most of the variation, there are only case reports in small families. So interpreting this data, whether this is disease causing or whether it is just an incidental finding, this becomes difficult, and that is why we need to build a good database for the Indian population. Now, genetics is extremely complex. Pathogenic mutations which are known to cause hypertrophic cardiomyopathy will be found only in around 40% or so. 60%, we will not be able to identify the sequence variation. The problem is that our ability to identify, we are very good at genotyping. We can do whole exome sequencing. We can do whole genome sequencing. at a very low cost. So our ability to identify sequence variations has far outstripped our ability to interpret the significance. So I'll just give you an example that in 2002, like if we would do a whole exome sequencing, the cost would be around 1 crore. That would be the cost for one individual. Today, we can get it done for 12,000 rupees. So that is the change in the technology. That is the amount of data that we can generate today. So it's a fraction. I mean, you can imagine for 1 crore, we can't even think of doing it. The cost is around 12,000 today. So, but the problem is that we are not able to interpret these sequence variations. As I said, all of us are different. All of us have sequence variations. So if we get a sequence variation in a disease-causing gene, we are not able to interpret it very well. And this is the problem of genetic studies right now. Each family, depending on the founder effect, may have its own specific mutation. Clinical decisions may be based on very little information about a given mutation. And that is why we need to build a good Indian database. We believe that hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or most cardiomyopathies are autosomal dominant disorders. But this may not be true. They may be more complex disorders. There may be 3, 4, or 5 variations which put together may be disease causing. And there may be several contributory variations which cause the disease. So it may not be due to a single variation, it may be due to multiple variations. So this is the point that I wanted to highlight. So what are the genotype-phenotype correlations as far as the data today is concerned? The classical description is that myosin binding protein C mutations cause late onset disease and which is relatively benign. Myosin heavy chain was said to cause a lot of hypertrophy with early onset, some malignant and some benign mutations. Troponin T was classical described as mild hypertrophy with severe disarray and high risk of sudden death despite mild hypertrophy. And troponin I was reported as a apical variant in the Japanese population. So we looked at troponin I mutations. So we looked at a large number of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy patients, and we found troponin I mutations in around 3.13% of the hypertrophic cardiomyopathy population. So after screening for the families, we were able to get 100 mutation carriers. So the penetrance we found was around 50% overall penetrance. Half of them had the disease. But when we look at the age-wise penetrance, we find that by the time they reach the age of 70, it has almost 100% penetrance. And the same gene, the troponin I gene, what we saw was all types of hypertrophy. We saw asymmetrical septal hypertrophy, apical hypertrophy, mid-cavity obstruction, biventricular hypertrophy, end-stage dilatation, as well as restrictive cardiomyopathy. So one particular gene giving rise to a large number of phenotypes. So at least troponin I, the genotype-phenotype correlation is very poor. So if you know a genotype, you cannot really predict the phenotype, at least as far as troponin I is concerned. They are extremely heterogeneous even within families. One family member may have one disease, another family member may have a very different phenotype. There is no specific mutation or disease-specific pattern. There is a variable age at diagnosis, and the penetrance keeps on increasing as the age increases. Therefore, lifelong follow-up is needed. However, we know that other genes like myosin heavy chain and troponin T mutations may be a little more homogeneous. So troponin T is classically described as minimal hypertrophy with high risk of sudden death and myocyte disarray. And this was demonstrated in several older studies, which like this study in 1995, this showed that left ventricular hypertrophy was much less, just around 16 millimeters, which would be moderate hypertrophy. However, despite mild hypertrophy or moderate hypertrophy, the life expectancy was limited. There was high incidence of sudden death. But these are relatively biased studies, the original studies. The actual incidence of troponin T is only around 3% in the population. So what about the survival in HCM? As we can see that some of the myosin heavy chain mutations have a very good survival. This is similar to the general population, whereas several of the myosin heavy chain and the troponin T mutation, the survival is quite poor when you compare it to the general population. And as we can see, the survival starts dropping after the second or the third decade of life. And then this keeps on increasing as the age increases. So as far as myosin binding protein C is concerned, we can see that as the age keeps on increasing, the penetrance is progressively increasing. And if we compare myosin binding protein C to troponin I, this was our study, and this is the myosin binding protein C, you can see that the graph overlaps. Only thing is that myosin binding protein C, everything happens 20 years later. So what happens in troponin I at the age of 30 would occur in a myosin binding protein C at the age of 50. And as we can see that once the disease occurs in myosin binding protein C, the disease is no longer benign. So the disease may occur later. The disease may occur at the age of 30 or 40. The onset of disease may be later. But once the disease shows up, even myosin binding protein C mutations are not benign. They have a very similar mortality as compared to myosin heavy chain and troponin T. And this is especially true for truncation mutations. The most common mutations are missense mutation, where there is just change in one amino acid. Truncation mutations are where the protein terminates, where the protein is different. That protein terminates prematurely. And these mutations have the worst prognosis. So as far as myosin binding protein C is concerned, the penetrance at 50% is only 58%. And the rest of the penetrance occurs after the age of 50. Survival is better than troponin T and myosin heavy chain. However, once the phenotype appears, once the hypertrophy appears on your echo, the outcome may be similar. The outcome is not better after the hypertrophy appears. So in late onset disease, it was said that traditionally in probands with early onset disease, clinical screening was recommended only till the age of 40. This no longer holds true. Patients can continue to get disease even in the age of 50s, 60s, and 70s. Therefore, lifelong screening is needed if we are going to do a clinical screening. And genetic screening is therefore useful that if a person does not carry the mutation, then he is not at risk of disease in future. So the other thing that I would like to consider is a restrictive physiology. And this is probably the subset of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy which has the worst prognosis. So if there is a restrictive hypertrophy, restrictive physiology, these patients do not do well. And this was shown in around 20 years back that when we screen restrictive cardiomyopathies, they commonly have mutations in troponin I. So we carried out a study in which we screened large number of patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and they had restrictive physiology with only mild hypertrophy. And in this, around 1.5% patients had a restrictive physiology. What was seen was that they had a much worse NYHA class. They had a lower 5-year survival, was much worse, 56% versus 90% in patients who did not have restrictive physiology. Atrial fibrillation was very common, and they had a poorer exercise capacity. So on screening these 19 patients, on genotyping these, what we saw was that troponin I mutations are present in 4 and myosin heavy chain were in 4. There were no mutations in any of the other genes that were screened. And what was highlighted was that troponin I mutations, although they are present only in 3% of the overall HCM cohort, they are very common in the troponin I cohort. And I'll just give you an example of restrictive physiology, that what is restrictive cardiomyopathy or idiopathic restrictive cardiomyopathy, which is the commonest form of restrictive cardiomyopathy. In India, there are 3 common causes of restrictive cardiomyopathy. The commonest is idiopathic restrictive cardiomyopathy. Number 2 will probably be amyloidosis, and third will be endomyocardial fibrosis. So idiopathic restrictive cardiomyopathy is the commonest cause of restrictive cardiomyopathy in Indians. So I'll just describe one of our families. So the father had restrictive cardiomyopathy. He did not have hypertrophy. He had a classical restrictive cardiomyopathy. He developed heart failure in his late 20s and progressive heart failure. He died at the age of 47 with progressive heart failure. This was the proband. Her elder sister had again restrictive cardiomyopathy without hypertrophy, and she had a sudden cardiac death at the age of 16 years. And this girl came to us. She had hypertrophy with an LV wall thickness of 16 millimeters, a restrictive physiology, and she was severely symptomatic. We can see that she had biatrial enlargement. There was some left ventricular hypertrophy. So she had a hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with a restrictive physiology. The endomyocardial biopsy typically showed myocyte disarray that is classically seen in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and she had a mutation in troponin I gene. There was only one previous report of this mutation, and this was a de novo mutation in a Caucasian with restrictive cardiomyopathy. So what is restrictive cardiomyopathy? We know that hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is a disorder. There may be mild hypertrophy or very severe hypertrophy. And we know that hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is a disorder of diastolic dysfunction. So there may be mild diastolic dysfunction or severe diastolic dysfunction. So what is restrictive cardiomyopathy? Severe diastolic dysfunction. So now if we look at this graph, if we look at this figure, what we can see is that from left to right, the hypertrophy is continuously increasing. So patients may have no hypertrophy to very severe hypertrophy. And from top to bottom, we can say that the diastolic dysfunction is worsening. And the bottom 1.5% are the individuals who have restrictive physiology. They have the worst diastolic dysfunction. So patients, it's the same disorder, sarcomeric gene mutation disorder. Patients who have no or mild hypertrophy and a restrictive physiology, that means a severe diastolic dysfunction, they will be called idiopathic restrictive cardiomyopathy. And patients who have a hypertrophy with a restrictive pattern, they will be called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with a restrictive physiology. So we must remember that restrictive physiology is nothing but a variation of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with severe diastolic dysfunction. If we go back to this family, so what we can see is that the father and this daughter had restrictive cardiomyopathy. They carry the same mutation. They have restrictive cardiomyopathy. That means they had no hypertrophy, but they had a restrictive physiology. This girl had hypertrophy with a restrictive physiology. So the terminology changes. So it's just a few millimeters of LV wall thickness and the disease changes. So basic thing is that is it time to redefine these disorders, that hypertrophic and restrictive cardiomyopathy, they are overlapping disorders. So sarcomeric gene mutation disorders with no hypertrophy will be called idiopathic restrictive cardiomyopathy. If hypertrophy is present, it will be called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy with restrictive physiology. So it's just a name. Around 50% of idiopathic restrictive cardiomyopathy are due to sarcomeric gene mutations. Restrictive cardiomyopathy and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy are similar etiologically, and different terminologies only reflect differences in a few millimeters of LV wall thickness. So idiopathic restrictive cardiomyopathy is basically a sarcomeric mutation disorder where there's no hypertrophy and there is a restrictive physiology. The other important thing we must realize is that when we look at hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, we must not miss out the mimics. That means conditions that would resemble hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And of course, the most common is hypertensive heart disease, which can sometimes be almost impossible to distinguish from hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. In addition to that, a good echo will pick up aortic stenosis and coarctation of aorta. Then there are a number of storage disorders, amyloidosis, mitochondrial myopathies, and rasopathies like Noonan syndrome. These are mimics. Then drugs can cause hypertrophy. These are anabolic steroid, tacrolimus, and even chloroquine, and in newborns of diabetic mothers. So we must screen for some of these disorders, and I'll demonstrate some of these. And we must remember that a rare disease is rare until you look for it. And once you start looking for it, some of these diseases that we will encounter some of these diseases at least occasionally, maybe 1 or 2 patients a year. So what are the phenocopies? So we must remember that when we look at something that resembles hypertrophic cardiomyopathy in infants and young children, sarcomeric hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is responsible for less than a fifth of the disorders. That means 80% will not have HCM. They'll likely have a storage disorder, or they'll have a mitochondrial myopathy. So newborns and young children, HCM is not very common in patients who have a HCM phenotype. As the age increases, so when we look at 1 to 18 years, more than half will have sarcomeric HCM, but many of them will also have storage disorders. So less than 1 year, what looks like HCM is usually not HCM. In middle age, we'll have to think of amyloidosis, Fabry's, and hypertension. And elderly, amyloidosis and hypertension. These are things that we should not miss out. So there are some hints which will tell us that this is not hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And one of them is pre-excitation. In fact, we have screened all our pre-excitation patients for whole exome sequencing, and we have found either a Danon or either a LAMP2 or a PRKAG mutation in each and every one of these patients. It is possible that HCM patients may have pre-excitation, but in our cohort of patients, every single HCM patient who has a pre-excitation has either a LAMP2 or a PRKAG2 mutation. And this makes them, the natural history and everything, different from hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Therefore, one thing is that if you find pre-excitation, you must screen for, I would recommend that we must do a genotyping, especially now the cost of genotyping has come down. So we must do a genotyping in every HCM patient who has pre-excitation. AV blocks also would suggest PRKAG2 and Danons. Most of our patients with HCM who have a AV block have a mutation in one of these disorders. In addition, mitochondrial disorders and amyloidosis may also occasionally have AV blocks. So if there's pre-excitation or AV blocks, we must think of glycogen storage disorders. Then extreme QRS voltages. You see very, very high voltages in all the precordial leads. Think of a storage disorder. But we must remember that pre-excitation alone may give rise to very high voltages. If there's muscle weakness, then again, we know that this is not hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. This involves a multisystem disorder. Then renal dysfunction may be in Fabry's or amyloidosis. Creatinine kinase must be tested in every HCM patient. If the creatinine kinase is raised, it's a LAMP2 mutation or a mitochondrial myopathy or one of those musculoskeletal disorders. In addition to that, we must screen for sensory neural deafness and learning disabilities. These indicate that it's not sarcomeric HCM, but it's some other disorder. Carpal tunnel syndrome. Any cardiac patient comes to you with breathlessness and carpal tunnel syndrome, please consider it to be amyloid unless proved otherwise. Then skin disorders like lentiginous or cafe au lait spots would again suggest something like a Leopard syndrome. And Fabry's disease also has skin manifestations. But the point that I would like to highlight is a carpal tunnel syndrome. Carpal tunnel syndrome, please look for amyloidosis. So we had earlier reported a long time, I think this is 2008, we had reported a large family. Genotyping that time was not available. So familial conduction disease associated with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And recently, when we screened maybe a year back, we found a PRKAG2 mutation. And what we see in a PRKAG2 mutation is that whatever changes, as you can see, there's pre-excitation, there's conduction defects. And what we can see, many of these family members have pacemakers for heart blocks. And what we can see is that the ECG changes have basically set in by the age of, like in this patient, the first ECG of 19 years, ECG changes have set in. And as we can see, over so many years, we have followed up this family, the ECG changes have not really progressed. Similarly, another patient, we can see that the ECG changes at the age of 15 years were already present, and this is the ECG at the age of 29 years. And this is some of the representative echoes in this family. What we can see is that there's left ventricular concentric, left ventricular hypertrophy, the significant hypertrophy, and in the presence of pre-excitation and heart block on this family, we must suspect a glycogen storage disorder, that is a PRKAG2. So this we had reported a long time back. This was a disease penetrance. What was found was that ECG, by ECG, the ECG is in a storage disorder. The ECG becomes abnormal much earlier than the echocardiography. The disease penetrance is 100% by the age of 18 in PRKAG2 mutations, whereas the left ventricular hypertrophy on echo is seen in only around 78%, and there is progressive left ventricular hypertrophy, whereas the ECG changes have already set in and are fixed by the age of 18 years. So the other glycogen storage disorder is a LAMP2 mutation. This is Dannon's disease. And here there is history of like poor in studies. This is a typical history, deranged liver enzymes, elevated creatinine kinase, and they have a poor outcome where there is heart failure as well as sudden cardiac death. So pre-excitation or heart block, please look for a glycogen storage disorder. This is not hypertrophic, and this is one of the patients with Danon disease. And as you can see in the apical 4-chamber view, there is severe left ventricular hypertrophy. So other condition which is relatively common is Fabry's disease, and it is worth, especially in males, it is worth doing an alpha galactosidase level in patients with male patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, especially when they complain of a lot of peripheral edema, they complain of sensory neural deafness or peripheral neuropathy, they complain of a lot of neurological pains, atypical symptoms. We must screen them for Fabry's disease, and we will find Fabry's disease in a significant number of these individuals. This is one of the echoes of one of the patients with Fabry's disease. As you can see, the hypertrophy can be quite severe in these individuals. So other thing very important that I just would like to highlight is that this is a patient who was referred to us with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. We must not miss out other disorders, and a careful echocardiogram is extremely important. We can see over here in the apical 4-chamber view, there is a subaortic membrane. This is highlighted over here. And as we can see that there is flow acceleration at the level of the subaortic membrane. So this is a treatable disorder, and we must do a careful echocardiogram so that treatable disorders like a subaortic membrane should not get missed, and even coarctation of aorta. These disorders should not be missed. Therefore, the important thing is that we should look for red flags. That means any other symptom. Is there conduction disease? Is there deafness? Is the patient complaining of some vague pains? Is there pedal edema? All these things would indicate that this is not hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or this may be some other disorder. The age of presentation is important. Infant less than 20% will have sarcomeric hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Most of them will have a storage disorder. Look for conduction disease. Look for creatinine kinase and muscle involvement in every patient with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Skin lesions. Careful echocardiogram. Do not miss a subaortic membrane or a coarctation of aorta. And ultimately, hypertension, especially in the elderly, can be almost impossible to distinguish from hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And many of these patients with hypertension even have left ventricular outflow tract gradients, and this can be almost impossible to distinguish in a large number of individuals, especially ones with uncontrolled hypertension. So as far as HCM management is concerned, there are two aspects. One is treatment of symptoms, and other is prevention of sudden cardiac death. And of course, genetic counseling, genotyping, and family screening is also important in these individuals. So secondary prevention, there is absolutely no ambiguity. If there's history of a cardiac arrest or a spontaneous sustained ventricular tachycardia, all these patients must be offered an ICD. For primary prevention, the indications for ICD are gradually increasing. Maybe around 15 years back or so, it was that if 2 risk factors are present, then one should go in for an ICD. But if we look at the recent guidelines, like if we look at the AHA guidelines, what we have now seen is that even if one risk factor is severe or significant, then one can advise an ICD. For example, family history of premature sudden death. If 1 or 2 close relatives have sudden death, then probably you can advise an ICD, even in the absence of other risk factors. Unexplained syncope, which is recent. So recent by definition is less than 5 years. So a syncope more than 5 years back does not, number of studies are now available that a syncope more than 5 years back is not associated with sudden death. LV wall thickness of more than 30 millimeters is a very major risk factor, and these patients should be offered an ICD. Earlier, an abnormal blood pressure response and exercise in young individuals was considered to be a risk factor. This has now been removed from the guidelines. This is no longer a risk factor, considered to be a risk factor. NSVT on Holter, especially if there are multiple NSVTs which are fast, longer NSVTs, they are associated with increased risk of sudden death. Late gadolinium on enhancement on MRI, especially in individuals whom you are doubtful whether to put an ICD or you don't want to advise an ICD. This is something that you can consider. So if there's late gadolinium enhancement, let us say 15 or 20%, you would probably recommend an ICD. If there's no late gadolinium enhancement in these borderline individuals, then you would probably say that not to put an ICD, because these are young individuals. They have a long period when they will need an ICD. So it's multiple device changes. There's risk of false shocks. There's risk of lead fractures, lead failures. And these are very significant in young individuals. So, I mean, it's unless there are good, strong risk factors, ICD has its own problem when you put them in and there's a long follow-up of 30, 40, 50 years of life expectancy after the ICD has been put in. Apical aneurysm is another risk factor for sudden death. Minor risk factors is atrial fibrillation, not a very important risk factor. Left ventricular outflow tract obstruction slightly increases the risk for sudden death. And a high risk mutation, this is not being very clearly defined. I think if there's a family history. So the European Society Cardiology HCM risk factor is also useful. This is something objective where you can give a number to a patient that your risk for sudden death over 5 years is 2%, 3%, 5%, 6%. The problem with this is that it does not include an MRI. So, and it does not include new risk factors like, let us say, apical aneurysms. And it does not apply to patients who have had an alcohol ablation or a myectomy. And young individuals who are less than 18 years of age. But definitely, it gives us a risk factor and it will give us a risk score over 5 years, the risk of sudden death over 5 years. And then maybe we can use an MRI or the presence of an aneurysm. And then we can advise a patient based on the risk score plus the other newer risk factors which have now been described. So wall thickness is a very important risk factor for sudden death. And what has been seen is that the patients who have the highest wall thickness, more than 30 millimeters, are at a much higher risk of sudden death as those who have less than 15 millimeters or less than 20 millimeters. So as we can see that HCM patients, majority of them have no risk factor, and 3 risk factors is present only in a small number. So the patients who have 2 risk factors, one must advise an ICD, and 1 risk factor is 1/3 of individuals. And these are the individuals where we must individualize the risk. Multiple family members who have died, first-degree relatives who had a sudden death at young age, lot of late gadolinium enhancement on ECG, lot of NSVTs. These are the patients in whom we can advise an ICD. But let us suppose you do a Holter, the only risk factors is 1 or 2 NSVTs or 4 or 5 beats. Probably one would advise to follow up. The other important thing is that risk for sudden death is not a one-time event. Risk stratification must be carried out every 3 years or so. So if there's a fresh syncope, repeat a Holter, and let us suppose there are multiple NSVTs, so a patient from a low risk can go into a high risk category after some time. So ICD is the only effective therapy to prevent sudden death. An appropriate discharge per year is around, for secondary prevention is around 11%, and for primary prevention is around 5%. And this is a typical ventricular fibrillation and a shock which is reverted to normal. But as I said, these are young individuals, and in young individuals, ICD, when it goes wrong, can be a very difficult and a painful thing for a patient. If an ICD gets infected, then removing the lead can be very, very difficult. We've had a patient with a heart transplant where the lead was so stuck that when the surgeon had access from the subclavian side as well as from the IVC side, the lead still could not be removed. These leads can be really stuck up. This is an individual, we touched a washing machine. As we can see, that this is an AC current which is giving rise to a baseline disturbance, which was detected by a ventricular fibrillation, and a false shock was delivered. We can see that the QRS, normal QRS is in the middle. So ICDs do have their problems in young individuals. So as far as activities are concerned, heavy activities like competitive sports, athletics, and all should be avoided. However, activities which are predictable, that means there's no sudden spurt where you suddenly start running from a sort of like a football or something, like cycling on level ground, non-competitive swimming, cricket, pony riding, even badminton doubles, all these activities can be permitted. So what are the drugs which are used? So one is first is of course beta blockers. Verapamil can be used instead of beta blockers, especially in patients who have angina. But we must remember that patients who have left ventricular outflow tract obstruction with severe symptoms and pulmonary hypertension, verapamil should be avoided because it is associated with sudden death in these individuals. In these patients, beta blockers is preferred. There is no evidence that combination of verapamil and beta blockers is better than either drug alone. So this is typical SAM. As we can see that in systole, the mitral valve is touching the septum. So SAM is a dragging or a pushing force. And in addition to SAM, there can be mid-cavity obstruction, which can be due to papillary muscle abnormalities and mitral valve abnormalities. Now, LVOTO is present in around 1/3 of individuals in the resting position. Another 1/3 have provocable gradients. That means when they exercise, they develop LVOTO. So around 2/3 of all HCM patients have got a gradient and 1/3 have non-obstructive HCM. And a gradient of more than 50 is an indication for intervention. And as we can see that patients with a gradient have much worse outcomes.
PGI का कुछ क्लास चल रहा है, सुन लो. आऊं क्या अभी आऊं?
Sorry, I've got disconnected in some way.
Dr. Pawan Poddar, please mute your.
Sorry, I've got. You can hear me.
No, Behel, we can hear you very well. Somebody.
Yes, sir, but my screen has got disconnected for some reason. Let me just.
But we
go back to screen sharing.
Okay.
Yes, now it's back. Now it's back. So they have a much worse outcome as far as Oh God, I don't know why it's happening. Okay, okay. Sorry, I'll move my slide like this now with this cursor. Right. So as we can see that their death is much higher. They are much more likely to die. Patients with obstruction, and what we can see is that sudden death is also higher in patients with obstruction. Although it's not a major risk factor, but there is a slightly higher incidence of sudden death also in patients who have a left ventricular outflow tract obstruction. So for patients with LVOTO, what are the options? It's beta blocker, that is the drug of first choice. Diazopyramide is available with us. Mavacamten is not available. Dual chamber pacing, alcohol ablation, myectomy, and these patients possibly should be considered for infective endocarditis prophylaxis. Beta blockers, we must remember, have effect only on provocable gradient. That means when they exercise or there's a high sympathetic activity, they have no effect on resting gradients. And diazopyramide is a very useful drug, and I think it should be tried in all individuals with gradient. It gives good symptom relief in around 1/2 to 2/3 of patients, and around 1/3 to 1/2 of patients do not benefit from diazopyramide. It causes an EF drop by around 5 to 10%. It reduces both the resting and the provocable gradient. It reduces the mitral regurgitation. It prolongs the QT. So the QT must be monitored in patients with diazopyramide. And the first ECG after starting the drug should be repeated at maybe 24 to 48 hours after starting the drug. The most important thing is that diazopyramide should always be combined with a beta blocker or verapamil. It enhances the AV nodal conduction, and if a patient develops atrial fibrillation and he's on diazopyramide, he is likely to develop a very fast ventricular rate, which can possibly degenerate into a VT or a ventricular fibrillation. So diisopyramide must always be combined with a beta blocker. It should never be used alone. It may occasionally be also useful in intracavity gradient. It should not be combined with other drugs that prolong the QT interval. Despite increasing the QT interval, there is very good data now to show that it does not increase the risk of sudden cardiac death in patients with HCM. Dual chamber pacing has not been shown to have any benefit in randomized trials except in elderly individuals more than 65 years of age. But we can see that when we do it in the lab, we can clearly see that it reduces the gradient, at least in the acute setting. And it may be worth considering in patients who have gradients at multiple levels. They've got an intracavity gradient, they have an outflow tract gradient, and other options are not available. And especially in elderly individuals, a dual chamber pacemaker, despite the data not being there to support in randomized trials, I think in individual patients, it does benefit. We have a few patients who have benefited from dual chamber pacemaker. We had some patients who underwent an alcohol ablation, had a complete heart block for which they had a dual chamber pacing. They continue to have a gradient. And once we put them onto a dual chamber pacing, the symptoms also improved and the gradient also recovered. So as far as alcohol ablation is concerned, in patients with LVOTO, this is the red area is the area we must ablate. We must ablate an area which must extend beyond the tip of the mitral valve. That is very important. The area where the SAM occurs, that area must be ablated. So whatever we are ablating, we must ablate a little beyond the tip of the mitral valve. And as we can see on echocardiographic contrast, I think this is where alcohol was already injected, and alcohol is a very good contrast agent. That we can clearly see the tip of the mitral valve. This contrast must extend beyond the tip of the mitral valve. Otherwise, a residual gradient is going to remain. Other thing is that whenever we do an alcohol ablation and we see a septal, like we can see the wire is in one of the branches of the septal and there is a distal septal that is fairly large. We must always initially try to ablate the proximal septal. If it is a LVOTO due to a SAM, we must always try to go for the earlier branch, and the alcohol ablation will always be more effective if you try to go in for the more proximal branch rather than the more distal branch of the septal. This is just highlighting that. The other thing is that even for patients with mid-cavity obstruction, we can consider alcohol septal ablation. Like this was a patient, he was elderly, he was quite sick, and he was NYHA class 4. And as we can see, he had a mid-cavity gradient. So in this individual, the septal that we selected, we can see we selected a very distal septal. And whenever, I think in all individuals, even in patients who have a typical outflow tract obstruction, but especially in patients who have a mid-cavity gradient, we must always use echo contrast, because once you use echo contrast, you know the area that is being ablated. And if we do not use echo contrast, then it is more or less, it's a blind procedure. So what is the echo contrast that is available? The best echo contrast which was available and is no longer available was Levovis, which was the first generation echo contrast agent. Nowadays, what are available with us are second generation or the newer echo contrast agent, and these are not suitable for alcohol septal ablation because the newer agents have one property, that they pass very efficiently through a capillary bed, and they are meant for IV contrast. They are able to pass through capillaries. And this very good property that makes them good echo agents make them useless as far as alcohol septal ablation is concerned, because they do not form a good depot inside the myocardium. They don't stay inside the myocardium. They'll immediately get flushed out. So today, the best and the cheapest echocardiographic agent that is available is agitated gelafuscin. This is gelatin that is used by the surgeons as a volume expander. It's extremely cheap. I think gelafuscin does not cost, it costs around 300 rupees. The only issue is that out of all the gelatins that are available with us today, gelafuscin is the only one which can really be used for alcohol septal ablation, because this is the only gelatin that does not contain potassium. All the other gelatins contain potassium, and then there is a risk of arrhythmias if you're going to inject gelatin, if you're going to inject potassium into the myocardium. This forms an excellent depot, and probably agitated gelafusine should be used in all patients who are undergoing alcohol septal ablation. Now, it's important to use it because sometimes we use the contrast agent, the radiographic contrast agent, but it's not that effective in the sense that the radiographic contrast agent may show up the septal very well. But let us suppose the RV free wall or the papillary muscle is getting filled up. This will get missed on a radiographic contrast agent. If we use an echocardiographic contrast agent like gelafusine, it really shows up well on the echo, and we are very sure of the area that is going to get ablated. So septal ablation is a relatively safe procedure. Now the incidence of AV block is also much lower. Earlier it was reported 15%. Now I think it is closer to around 5%. The only thing is that the gradient reduction is gradual. So we do an alcohol ablation, and after 2 or 3 months we find that there is still a gradient. I think it's time to be patient. We should wait for another 3 to 6 months. I've seen a number of patients who have a gradient at even 3 months of follow-up, and you find at 7-8 months of follow-up, the gradient has disappeared, as there is remodeling of the septum. So to summarize, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy or all cardiomyopathies must be looked at as genetic disorders. The genetics is complex. There is increasing role of genotyping, but we must remember it's not very easily interpreting a mutation. You get troponin I, arginine 242 lysine. So how do you interpret it? It's not very easy. We must look for mimics, and LVOTO today is a treatable disorder. Thank you. I'll just end my screen sharing.
So over to you, Dr. Wonder sir, and Dr. Datta, Dr. Shetty.
So let me start. Let me at the outset thank Dr. Ajay Bahal for this remarkable talk, one of the best actually talks on hypertrophic cardiomyopathy that I have heard. And we all have a lot of patients of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy on our follow-up. It does open a couple of vistas and thoughts in our mind, actually. One of the most I would say bold statements which I heard today was that restrictive cardiomyopathy, the idiopathic variety, is a form of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and you even have some publications to that extent. So we will actually need your thoughts on this to a little greater extent. Does this interpolate in terms of choices of therapy also when you are managing patients with this idiopathic variety of restrictive cardiomyopathy presentation of patients? That is one important thing that I would like to know from you. Second, genetics, we have heard from you before, and I was reading somewhere, correct me, that there are some 9 genes which are more common, and so do they form a panel of genes, or is it a whole exome? What is exactly done? And do we mention that these are the 8 or 9 or 10 genes which are responsible in our population? And if they are negative, do we take it as a negative genetic test in these people? And in clinical terms, how often do you use, genetic testing in your patients? Or rather, I would say, how often do you suggest to us? You must be doing in most of your patients, but let me ask you, how often do you suggest to those who are not doing actually a research project or looking at what evolutionary, you are one of the pioneers, so you are obviously, there is a reason. So tell us on these 2 factors. Third, I would like to know from you, a clinical challenge that we face often is patients who are young, Those are the patients in whom actually sudden cardiac death, the commonest cause is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And a lot of these are athletes. So we know the European Society has given this cutoff value of 30, 15, and generally it is thought to be 13 septal thickness. So what all can help us in this subset of patients? So I know these are three loaded questions, but there are so many more questions. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is such an interesting condition. I know my other colleagues would like to ask you, maybe in the end, then I can chip in with some of the other doubts that I have in management of these patients. Dr. Behl, please.
Right. Thanks. So, as far as restrictive cardiomyopathy is concerned, around 50% of idiopathic restrictive cardiomyopathy, when we do a genotyping, we will get sarcomeric mutations in the same genes which cause hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And maybe there are some specific mutations which are likely to cause worse diastolic function and restrictive cardiomyopathy. So they are basically overlapping disorders. Now, as unfortunately, the treatment for restrictive cardiomyopathy is there's no specific treatment as such, and these patients don't do very well. The only thing is that they are at a very high risk of atrial fibrillation. So although it is not there in the guidelines, the only thing is that if these patients have a large atrium, let us say more than 45 or 50, it might be worth putting them on anticoagulation, because a number of them have strokes. I've seen a good number of them having strokes. And so in the setting of a large atria, probably despite it not being in the guideline, one should consider anticoagulation. Now, regarding the usefulness of genotyping, that who are the patients in whom we do genotyping? So one is, I think we should, to answer a clinical question, like the family that I showed, the father died, the sister, one sister, elder sister died. This one sister had restrictive cardiomyopathy, HCM with restriction, and there was a younger brother. So the brother was only 7 years old when he came to us. So the mother wanted to know that is this boy at risk for getting the disease in future, because a horrible disease in the family. So we screened we were able to identify the mutation in the family, and the brother did not carry the mutation. So we were able to clearly tell the family that this child is not going to develop disease in future. So whereas on clinical screening, one can't say that. The child may develop the disease at the age of 15 years or 20 years or 30 years, like the father became symptomatic in his mid-20s. So I think if there is a clinical indication, that is the best time to do a genetic study. The second thing is, it's very important to identify storage disorders. So one is, if there is a pre-excitation or a heart block in the family, we should advise genetic screening. And right now, the genetic screening does not help us in preventing the disorder or in treating the disorder, but it's very good for family screening, like to find out relatives who are affected. Like if you identify a mutation in a child, you can tell them, don't get into a profession or don't get into an education pattern which will require heavy physical exertion. So this is more from a clinical variant. As far as the screening methods are concerned, there are two basic methods that are available to us right now, and both of them cost roughly the same. They would cost around 12,000, 12,000 or so. So one is a whole exome sequencing, and the other is a cardiomyopathy panel. Now, most of the cardiomyopathy panels that are available, they are fairly standard, and they include around 110, 120 genes. They include all the genes which are presently known to cause hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And outside a research setting, probably doing a panel is better, because a whole exome sequencing will generate so much of data which will make interpretation very, very difficult. So I would say that a cardiomyopathy panel would be a better screening tool as compared to a whole exome sequence.
The third one was on accident. I mean, that open. The third one was on young adults, athletes, sports persons.
Yes. So young athletes, I don't know. We don't encounter this problem very often. So in young athletes, like I've had one or two, I've seen very few athletes in whom maybe areas which have a lot of sportsmen and all that, this would be more common, but I've encountered very few, and probably deconditioning is something that would help. That if the LV wall thickness is more than 15 or 16 millimeters, it is not likely to be athlete's heart. If the LV cavity is very small, again, it's not going to be athlete's heart. The LV in an athlete's heart, if the LV cavity is also on the larger side. So if we see a LV cavity of 30, 35, 40 millimeter, it would not be an athlete's heart. And the best way to do it is that decondition the individual. And if the hypertrophy still persists, likely that it is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And this is one situation where genetic screening can also help. If it is HCM, there's a good 40-50% chance that we'll identify a mutation. And if we identify a mutation, then we know that it is likely to be hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So I think deconditioning helps. I've had 2 individuals like this. They deconditioned and yet the hypertrophy persisted. So, I mean, frankly speaking, I haven't really encountered an athlete's heart, that classical description till now. I don't know. It's not very common in our setting.
Well, thank you. Let me request Dr. Ranjan Shetty and Dr. Barnoli Datta. They can, or Smith, as you want.
There's a question in the chat box also, sir. Maybe Dr. Datta can help us with that.
Sir, sometimes we get some, am I audible, sir?
Yeah,
Yes, yes, clearly.
Sometimes we get some patients who are referred to us for job recruitment. Actually, if they are diagnosed with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, there will be concentric hypertrophy, and somebody diagnoses as hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and sometimes they are rejected from recruitment. Then they come to us if their job is in the peripheral setup, like they have to go for field walk and it's a moderate physical activity. Is there any contraindications, or whether they should be allowed to walk, or they should have some restrictions?
I think if they are joining a heavy activity that involves like maybe the army or the police or something that involves heavy physical activity, then probably one may consider. But I think on a day-to-day job, it should not matter, because I mean nowadays people with large handicaps, congenital heart disease and all, they are also I don't think it should be for most professions, I don't think it should be a handicap unless it involves heavy physical exertion. I think all people with whatever disease should be encouraged to.
Yes. Dr. Bahal, thank you very much. And, you know, we always remember your teaching all the time, anytime we are here. So I have one question, Dr. Bahal. In case if there is a, say, MRI shows 0 late gadolinium enhancement, is it good enough to tell that this patient is definitely very low risk, or should we do all other risk stratification?
No, I mean, as far as the current status is concerned, we cannot go only by the MRI.
No.
I think if the other risk factors are there, and if the LG is 0 on MRI, then we have to go by the other risk factors. We should not put an ICD just because there's no LGE on MRI, because there is some data to show that patients with LGE on MRI, the risk of sudden death is very low. But let us suppose the wall thickness is 30 millimeters, and the LG is 0. I would still recommend ICD. The only thing is that individuals who are borderline, you know, I mean, where the risk is plus minus, and you want to take a decision this way or that way, probably in these individuals, currently we can use an MRI.
What about the other way, Dr. Bahal? If it is say 25% LGE, and would you consider, well, MRI is now very easily available.
We must do MRI in all. Absolutely.
All,
MRI we must do in all individuals.
Yes.
So again, I mean, if MRI as an isolated risk factor, I don't know. I don't think one would consider that. But I would say that if a patient has a lot of LGE on MRI, I'm sure that some other risk factor is going to fit in. I have not seen a single patient with lot of LGE on whom, let us say, there are no NSVTs on Holter or other risk factors were not there. So I think if there's NSVT on Holter and 25%, one would probably go in for it. it would push your decision in one direction, but I don't think it should be the only factor that it should
Yes,
just guide your decision.
Yes.
We should not make it the only factor.
One more question, Dr. Bell. Myomectomy versus alcohol septal in most centers now, there is proficiency of both. So how do we choose this for our patients? Yeah.
I would in young individuals who are very symptomatic, I would prefer myomectomy because I've seen a few individuals, children who have had alcohol ablation and then later they've ended up with a severe MR and that leads to problem. Actually, what happens is that HCM is an evolving disease. The heart continues to evolve. So especially at the time of the growth spurt. So you can have a hypertrophy of 12 millimeters and you do it after 1 year, it's gone up. The pattern of hypertrophy can also change over a period of time. So it's not a one-point disorder. It's something that is evolving. And if we ablate for young children, I would still prefer up to maybe 18, 20 till the time of the growth spurt. I would prefer a myomectomy.
Dr. Behel, are there surgeons available in our country? What's the current, I mean, what you would know what the volume, how much of septal myomectomy has been done? I remember 20 years back, I once came to PGI when you started this alcohol ablation. There was some foreigner with whom you had done three. Yeah, I don't remember the name, but you did three or four cases at that time. So we would certainly like to know what's the current status in terms of alcohol ablation. But my impression is there aren't many surgeons who can really do this kind of surgery. I mean, what's the current status in our country?
In PGI, we are doing around 7-8 myomectomies in a year. That is the rough number. So I mean, alcohol ablation is a very, very good. Once the child crosses that age of 18, 19, where the growth spurt is over, then alcohol ablation, I mean, I'm very, it should not be a problem around 20 years of age and above. But in children who are growing, I have seen a few problems. So I'm a little cautious about doing, either you let them grow for some time, maybe observe them for 1 or 2 years and see whether the hypertrophy is increasing, the pattern is changing. I think for children who are in the growth spurt, we should give them time to see how the disease is evolving, and we should not go in for an early alcohol ablation. That is what I've seen. MR, I mean, few children who have not done well after a few years. I mean, these problems will show up after immediate result might be good, but these problems will show up after a few years. So, I mean, I agree. I mean, it's a problem that may not be available in many centers, but I think in children, we should generally avoid alcohol ablation.
Transplant, when do you consider transplant for these patients?
Transplant?
Yeah, cardiac transplant. Like a failure. Because that should be acute. Yeah.
We have, except for patients who develop a DCM-like picture, I can't recall any patient who has had refractory heart failure symptoms. I'm sure a few patients would have who have a lot of intracavity gradient and all that, but now we have had surgeries which are done trans-aortic also, without cutting, without going through the left ventricle, without producing a scar, where the surgeon has been able to go deep into the cavity. And I think it will probably only be in patients who have a restrictive physiology or an end-stage heart disease. Most of the other patients are managed with alcohol ablation, myectomy, or drug therapy. Restrictive do very bad. They would be one group which probably need a heart transplant.
Maybe we can open it to others. I can see a lot of other PGI alumni, Dr. Swami, Dr. Nikhil. Anybody else has questions?
I have a different suggestion and a question whether you use machine learning. Dr. Wander has used machine learning and made a model for ICU admission and cardiac admissions and discharge. So probably a machine learning can help you here very much. That is what I feel in picking up, outcomes, because still most of the mutations, they have a lot of overlap. You don't have a fixed model with one of the mutations that it would have a typical phenotype and it will have a typical outcome. So it seems that every mutation, it is causing every kind of phenotype and it is causing every kind of genotype. I think we can have something with help of Dr. Wander sir, that machine learning, it's a very easy thing where the same data is used, maybe 60% or 80% of the data is used to project, to make out a conclusion, to draw, make a machine, and then that is tested on the rest 40% or 20% of the same model, same data.
That is
I'm sure they must be doing it for the this gene testing, because with so many genetic linkages coming up, that's how these bioinformatics people must be coming to some, and very aptly Dr. Bahal said some of these genetic linkages must be getting deleted subsequently and some new getting added, because it's still an evolving. And as you rightly said, Smith, whenever the data is enormous in large in numbers, that's where statistics fail, and that's where bioinformatics and AI machine learning comes in. So probably that's
Dr. Bahal, do you have any experience with torsion echo and strain echo to distinguish different, mimickers, hypertension and?
No, I have not done in much of strain echo and torsion echo in HCM patients. Regarding this machine learning, in the UK, they have done that. They have around, in machine learning, the most important thing is the phenotyping has to be of very high quality. So they have done for 60,000 individuals. That's a huge number. They've done an MRI as per a standard protocol. They've done an exercise test as per a standard protocol, ECG, a stress test, and they have done a whole genome sequence. Now, in the US, there is a recent NIH grant, which is there for 1 lakh individuals, which they plan to expand to 1 million individuals. This is cardiac phenotype. I'm saying the cardiac MRI. So this is the huge amount of data, which is very reliable and done in a very standardized manner. And all these data is finally, before being put up, going through a reference laboratory. And when you have such a huge amount of data, even things which produce a very, very tiny variation, this variation will increase your QRS duration by 1 millisecond. They are able to generate this type of data of 2 milliseconds. So when the numbers are so huge, this type of, and this data we will have a huge amount of this data available to us within the next 5-6 years.
Just tell us about disopyramide, something that, another thing out of your talk which really fascinated me. What percentage of your patients and what kind of patients do you really use it? Because to a simple clinician like me, actually, my dictum is patients who have obstruction and gradient, I put them on beta blockers. Patients who don't have a gradient and obstruction, I put them on verapamil. But this brings in another, we've all read that disopyramide is an excellent drug, negative inotropic effect, so very good for these people. But clinically using it, how frequently does it happen?
So it helps in around half. In half of them, the symptoms will disappear. It's very, very effective. In some patients, don't benefit at all. But half the patients become completely asymptomatic. So it's a which is worth trying. And especially in patients where the treatment options are not there. There are some patients who've got an outflow tract gradient. They've got an intracavity gradient at the papillary muscle. And so when you look at the septum, the flow acceleration is starting from the apex and continuing right till the base. So in these, myectomy is also not very easy. Alcohol ablation is not a possibility. And many of these patients respond to disopyramide. And in fact, for a few years when disopyramide was not available, these patients were so dependent on disopyramide, they were getting it from Canada or from other countries because the symptoms became so severe.
Because I am of the era when disopyramide was available and
Yes.
used when I was doing so. Because most of these young cardiologists would not have used it that much, but we used to use it in 86, 87. It was freely available, and it was in our time only. I would say that myodrone came. So before that, all these agents were in use.
Dr. Ajay, please.
First of all, congratulations. We listened spellbound all through with whatever problems of network I had. Really enjoyed your talk. Just three little things, sir. What about mavacamten, omecamtiv, the negative inotropic agents? Number two, there's a little bit of data on genetic modification now, using various techniques to try and see what they can do to genes. Any progress on that? And lastly, alcohol septal ablation. We are still using our same protocol of, that is, try and document how much effort tolerance the patient has. And those who've got poor effort tolerance, along with the gradient, which you can measure on the echo, then we use the endpoints of, 1 ml per 10 millimeters and cut down the gradient, resting gradient to 20, and cut down the post-ectopic gradient by half, and then follow them up. In our experience for around 59, about 25 to 30%, we have had to go in again. And as you said, we have started delaying the second ablation. We're making it more than 6 months because, as you said, we have a triphasic response, and many patients actually continue to respond even after the initial, the gradient falls, then it rises, and then it falls again. That's what we found. And many patients, it continues to fall actually. So we try and delay the second thing. Just a little input from our side.
Actually, mavacamten is not available with us. So one of my patients had gone to the US and tried to procure it. I think it was very expensive. So when it is available, it will be a substitute for disopyramide. And we'll have to see that which patient benefits more from mavacamten, which one benefits more from disopyramide. So it just becomes another option. The other thing is that it is also been tried in patients with non-obstructive cardiomyopathy. And maybe that it's useful, but I mean, the data is not yet very strong. I think the alcohol, what was the second thing? The alcohol ablation, I think the protocol that we are using is still very effective. I think as long as we are using eco contrast and we know the area that is going to be ablated, I think it's a very effective protocol.
Genetic engineering, he was asking.
Genetic engineering. Now, as far as genetic engineering is concerned, I think there's nothing so far, but what we are able to do now and do it at not a very large cost is that we are able to take the peripheral blood of these individuals and convert the white blood cells into iPSCs, that is induced pluripotent stem cells, and convert these into cardiomyocytes. So these are called iPSC cardiomyocytes, and these can be frozen and you can use them for testing. So they give very good data as far as the electrophysiology of what these changes are. So you can get what are the calcium currents, what it causes, what is the contractile force that it generates, what is the stiffness that it causes. So there is, and this can be done on a relatively large scale. But as far as using it for therapeutics, I don't think genetic modification has really been feasible so far. Of course, the other thing is if we can use it for prenatal diagnostic. Actually, the gynae people are not very keen because they say that it's not a disorder that is very severe or life-threatening or something of that sort. So they're not very keen. But we had a few families, like we had one family where 2 sudden deaths in children. The third child is also very severely affected. So when they want to plan a 4th family and we know the mutation, we can do a amniocentesis, and if the child carries a mutation, probably in patients with very severe disease, we can consider it for genetic counseling, and in case we identify the mutation in these individuals. Something like beta blockers versus verapamil. I think there's very little to choose between them. If there's angina, then probably verapamil may be better. If there's breathlessness, beta blocker may be better, but then this is interchangeable. Only thing is that if there's left ventricular outflow tract obstruction, which is severe, and there is pulmonary hypertension, in these individuals, verapamil should be avoided. In these beta blockers are preferred. Otherwise, in all other individuals, there's very little to choose between them. It's a hit and try. Try either of them, but better not to combine both.
There's some animal study with gene silencing with CRISPR technology, sir. We had reviewed it recently. That is why I know for some teaching program.
CRISPR is,
They are doing some.
yes.
They're doing some gene silencing for
Yes.
HCM. It's still in animal studies. That's what they
Yes.
say. So we have to learn
Yes.
about it. But
Yes,
the
that is-
research article
that
was
is-
very, very positive about how successful they have been in those, and they're very confident that they'll bring it to humans in the next half a decade or so.
That definitely. I mean, there are 2 or 3 technologies which are available for doing the same thing that CRISPR does. CRISPR does it very cheaply. So what CRISPR does is that it targets a particular mutation that is cut out there and the correct sequence is inserted. That is CRISPR. Now, the same thing can be done using viruses. The problem with CRISPR is that it damages the other part of the DNA also. You know, we are in creating these iPSC cardiomyocytes. We are in our lab in PGI, we are using viruses. We are not using CRISPR. So we are trying to do the same thing, that we are inducing the mutation in cardiomyocytes, in rat cardiomyocytes. So rat myocardiomyocytes which are normal, we are trying to pick up a particular mutation and transfer it to the rat cardiomyocyte. But the problem in all this is that this is not perfect. So whenever you use a CRISPR technology, it just doesn't target that particular area. It damages a lot of, produces a lot of DNA changes in the area around it or in other chromosomes also. So that is probably a limitation. And the other thing is that in how many, like you're doing it in a heart, let us suppose you're doing it in blood, it's relatively easy that you do it outside the body and you transfuse it. When you do it inside the heart, it's not that effective. I mean, it may not, it's not that easy. I agree. I mean, maybe in the future, but right now it's not something which is of therapeutic value.
I would personally feel that hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is a rather, it's not a bad disease because 2/3 of the people have a normal longevity of life. This kind of CRISPR technologies are more for diseases which affect longevity to a larger extent. So there are 3 or 4 diseases, I think, which they have used. And I think cystic fibrosis is one. I was reviewing one recently for the API. I delivered a talk. And there are probably 3 or 4 in humans where it has been used for. Mostly those are diseases which are which present at a very young age and have a bad prognosis.
Good evening, sir. So I have one question: is how you will proceed differentiate between the hypertensive LVH versus SCM patient, young patient with thickness of more than 20 mm, and how will we differentiate it from hypertension?
I think this is one of the most difficult topics. I find it almost impossible to distinguish in a very significant number of individuals. They would resemble each other. In fact, even the histology can be very similar. So it's a difficult diagnosis. So HCM is, the definition is hypertrophy with no underlying cause, where you cannot explain the hypertrophy. So now many of the HCM patients also have hypertension. So do you have hypertension that is severe enough to explain the hypertrophy? It's
Okay.
difficult. I think in HCM, the most difficult to definitely distinguish is probably hypertensive heart disease. So there are few of markers. Concentric hypertrophy, likely to be maybe hypertension. If the hypertrophy is not concentric, if it's asymmetrical hypertrophy, HCM. This is a very good indicator. The second is presence of left ventricular outflow tract gradient. I've seen this in a good number of patients with hypertension also. So especially in the elderly, it doesn't distinguish very well. But if you get an LVOTO in a younger individual, probably it would go for hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So I think the pattern of hypertrophy would help. And the severity of hypertension, the duration of hypertension, these would be indicators.
Does ECG also help, Dr. Bahl? Like any bizarre ECG versus classical LVH or something? Do you take
Yeah.
that into?
It might, I guess,
Yeah,
ECG might help, but
Yeah.
I mean, the changes can be fairly similar.
Mm.
I find it very difficult to distinguish it in a good number of individuals.
I think, Smith, it is time to thank Dr. Bahl because we virtually squeezed him and profusely. Let's thank him for remarkable, handling of all our doubts and clarifying them so beautifully. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And thank you, Smith.
And I hope, sir, we
Thank
meet
you,
in
sir.
the
It was a
next,
Thank you. Thank you.
next month, 4th Saturday, sir. Again, we'll have some, I'm relying more on Dr. Wander, sir, that we can catch hold of Dr. Anand or.
Right, surely, definitely. Yeah.
Sure. Thank you, sir, and good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Great pleasure to see you, sir.
Thank you. Okay, Ajay. Bye-bye.
Bonari,
Bye.
Dr.
See you.
Bonari, very nice.
And come over to
nice,
Chandigarh.
very nice to
Thank
see you,
you,
Dr.
sir.
Bonari.
Thanks a lot, sir.
Yes, sir. Definitely, I'll come. I'll come.
Okay, bye.
Right, sir. Right. Bye, Dr. Smith. Nice seeing
Good
you.
night, sir.